Welcome, everyone, to episode 48 of Redesigning Cities, the Speedwell Foundation Talks at Georgia Tech. I'm your host, Ellen Dunham-Jones, professor in the School of Architecture, where I also direct the Master of Science in Urban Design. So happy Halloween, everyone. We have quite a treat for you this afternoon. And in the spirit of Halloween, we will be talking about walkability. I mean, how often do people, that's how the youngest generation always learns how to meet their neighbors and the importance of walkability. You don't want to be trick-or-treating in a neighborhood that you have to drive to every house. That's not efficient. We all know. So it's very appropriate that here on Halloween, we are talking about walkability and about diets, another aspect of Halloween. Two terrific speakers, Mayor Mick Cornett and city planner Jeff Speck. Check out both of their TED Talks, really, really amazing. They are going to share with us how they took Oklahoma City from being one of the most obese and least walkable cities to one of the most fit, with a thriving downtown that they put on a massive road diet. So Mayor Mick Cornett is the second truly impactful mayor we've had in this little sub-series focusing on impactful mayors. And he too was reelected to a record-breaking 4 terms. It tells you something about both the popularity of mayors who actually get things done and the time it takes to make that really big impact. A journalist before he entered politics, Mick is a proponent for rapid and mass transit, economic diversification, civic beautification, and urban renaissance. As mayor of Oklahoma City, he succeeded in gaining passage of a $777 million quality of life infrastructure program that resulted in significant job and population growth. He brought the city its first major league sports team, and his This City is Going on a Diet.com website and healthy initiatives succeeded in transforming the city's reputation from one of the least to most fit cities in the country. And after he did that, he hired Jeff Speck. Jeff Speck is a truly impactful architect, planner who both assists mayors like Mick, but also through his writings, teaches us all how to better redesign our cities. His book, Walkable City, is the best-selling city planning title written this century. He doesn't quite beat Jane Jacobs, but he's the Jane Jacobs for this century. As director of design at the National Endowment for the Arts, he presided over the Mayor's Institute on City Design. Prior to his federal appointment, Mr. Speck spent 10 years as director of town planning at DPZ and Company, the most influential firm behind the new urbanism movement, where he led the writing of Suburban Nation, The Rise of Sprawl and the Decline of the American Dream. Since 2007, he has led Speck and Associates, now Speck Dempsey, where his work has focused on making vibrant downtowns and new towns. So with that, I'm going to invite Jeff to share his screen. I'll stop sharing mine.
This week won't last, but let me just say that Brent, the planner, that was a great introduction, Ellen. And I guess I should thank Ellen, who I've known for decades, several, maybe 3 decades, as a leading voice in this movement as well. You might know her as a leading professor at Georgia Tech, but she's really had an international impact in the work that we do. I hope you can take me seriously with this wig on as I say these things. Also, the planner, Brent Todderin, talks about what he calls the trick-or-treat test, which is a way to figure out whether a neighborhood is a place you want to live in or not. It's a very apt thing to discuss today. But I know I have limited time. I also want to thank Mayor Mick Cornett, one of my first clients when I opened my practice after my time at the NEA, and a client for whom and with whom I was able to do one of the most impactful and influential projects that I ever worked on, thanks to his leadership. And I'll be showing you that today. So let me become myself. There we go. Maybe that's scarier, actually. And the wig was my attempt to be the Jane Jacobs of this century, Ellen.
Okay.
So I will share my screen to be efficient. And Ellen remarked how many slides I have, but actually it's the right amount for 15 minutes or so, which is about 100 slides, because I go fast. And I'm telling the story of Project 180, which was a project that I took on around 2009, I believe. We'll get to the details in a bit. But let's back up a little bit and talk about the theory behind the work and the books that I've worked on, and the concept of the general, what I call the general theory of walkability, which asks the question, how do you get people to walk in our society in which most people have cars and driving is so easy and so subsidized, and every mile costs less than the mile before. The smart thing to do if you have a car is to drive it as much as you can. Under these circumstances, the way to get people to walk is to have a walk that's as good as a drive. And if the walk's going to be as good as the drive, it has to do four things simultaneously. It needs to be comfortable and it needs to be interesting. So that is the structure of most talks that I give. In Oklahoma City, we really focused on the safe walk because that was mostly what was keeping people from walking in downtown. This is what downtown Oklahoma City looked like when I first got involved. And it was the victim of I.M. Pei was a great architect, no doubt. But Oklahoma City was one of a number of cities that was harmed, I think, by the embrace of an autocentric, futuristic plan by I.M. Pei. And we all know that many cities celebrated highways, celebrated automobiles, celebrated high rises in open space that fail to give you that sense of spatial definition of outdoor living rooms that make a place comfortable, which I'll be talking about a little. But luckily, a lot of this plan was not implemented in Oklahoma City, such as the giant bus terminal on the highway. But the typical street did look like this because they were sized in anticipation of huge amounts of traffic that didn't come. And the mayor called me in because they were described in Prevention Magazine's best walking issue as the worst city for pedestrians in the entire country, which is not true, but that's kind of an important label to want to throw off when you get it. And Mayor Cornett came to me and said, what can we do? And I said, let's do a walkability study. And he said, what's that? And I said, actually, I don't know what it is. Let's figure it out together, because I had never done one. I've since, and with my colleagues, done about 20 walkability studies for different cities. We can see this one was in 2009. And we basically, this is me back then, a little more hair, a leather jacket I unfortunately left on a plane and miss. But you can see my discomfort being photographed in the middle of a street in the city. And the walkability study talked about all four aspects of what makes a place walkable. So the proper balance of uses, which in most cases, most American cities is about bringing more housing downtown, making walking safe, which is where we're going to dwell today, making walking comfortable and interesting, which is about making outdoor living rooms, creating spatial definition in our public places so that they give you that sense of refuge that you don't get when you're walking past two parking lots or a very wide street. And then, of course, having friendly faces on buildings and signs of humanity. And, what interests us is other people, and we want to understand that when we walk down the street. But we really focused on the safe category. And what this plan did, because, there's about 10 different things, 11 or 12 different things that cities can do to make the streets safer, essentially to get drivers to drive the speed limit, which is what we're struggling to do in our cities. But the ones that really applied the best in Oklahoma City were these 7. Right-sizing the number of lanes, right-sizing the lanes themselves, right-sizing the left-hand turn lanes, completing the conversion back to two-way streets because they had already begun that, reinstituting continuous on-street parking, creating a continuous canopy of street trees and getting the details right. So that's what we looked at. I'm going to focus on these again that I just read to you. I don't need to read them again. Now, right-sizing the number of lanes, we had this condition where there was a tremendous mismatch between the volume of traffic, which you see here, and the number of lanes in the streets. We know, no engineer will dispute, that a 2-lane street without turn lanes can handle 10,000 cars a day. And we had these streets in the downtown core with 6,000, 3,000, 5,000 cars per day that were principally sized at 4 to 6 lanes. And they were in the current plan to remain that size. And we said, you have this tremendous mismatch, as I said, between supply of lanes and demand for lanes. So that was item number 1. Number 2 is that there were lanes that were too wide. And of course, people driving know a wider lane is a highway lane. A wider lane feels like a lane that you can speed on. The wider lanes are, the faster people go. This is the NACDO standard now, getting us back to what used to be the standard of 10-foot lanes. Many cities have lanes that are 12 feet wide, 14 feet wide. 10 feet is perfectly wide, as you can see with this SUV and this truck. It fits. And Oklahoma, of course, has a lot of cities with a lot of lanes that are 15 feet wide, 20 feet wide. And in Oklahoma City, they weren't that bad, but they were wider than they should have been. Next is right-sizing the left turn lanes, or actually, I should say, eliminating the ones we didn't need. A left-hand turn lane adds tremendous capacity to a street. And adding a left-hand turn lane or a center lane to a 2-lane street gives it as much capacity as a 4-lane street without turn lanes. So we looked for streets that, what we decided, based on this measure is that, and this was such an important part of the decision-making, that if a street did not have more than 10,000 cars per day on it, it did not get any left turn lanes. And that was a decision that caused people some real agita. Next, many American cities, and we've done a whole bunch of them, have been reverting their one-way streets back to 2-way travel. It's better for commerce and it saves lives. The famous article in Governing Magazine by Alan Arenholt told the story of Vancouver, Washington, which tried all the tricks of the 80s, the bricks, the berms, the banners, the bandstands, the bollards, and the balloons, and was unable to bring their main street back to life until they convinced the state DOT to make it 2-way travel. And then if you ask the merchants, as Alan covered in this article, the merchants said, we're getting twice the business because people are no longer speeding down our street. They're actually stopping and parking and shopping. That's the business side. On the safety side, this is Louisville, Kentucky, where we're actually working right now on a plan to revert the entire downtown, which is entirely one-way almost, back to entirely 2-way almost. But here's 4 streets from right to left, Brook, First, Second, and Third, that were all one-way. But Brook and First, the ones on the right-hand side, were reverted to 2-way travel. And when they did that, car crashes went down 48%, and even crime went down. The one-ways, the crashes went up and crime went up. So cities are doing that much more universally now. Next, continuous on-street parking. On-street parking is an essential barrier of steel that protects the sidewalk from moving vehicles. I used to say that. I learned it from Andre Stwani, and then I experienced it in Fort Lauderdale when I did a walkability study, where before my study, you were not allowed to park on the outbound side of the street during happy hour, because God knows you don't want people staying in town and having happy hour. But notice that you can park on the left side of the street, not the right side of the street. Here's happy hour on the left side of the street. Here's happy hour on the right side of the street. No one wants to sit, eat, dine, hang out, walk against a curb, which has cars moving right against it at 30 miles an hour. And then the other part of this picture, the continuous canopy, the trees that sit between you and the street. They used to be called FHOs, fixed hazardous objects, by the engineers. The expectation was they made streets more dangerous, and on highways they do. But a very important study in Florida showed that, in Orlando, showed that the same street, the section that had vertical trees next to it, had fewer crashes, had no deaths, compared to the other section that was much more dangerous because trees slow cars down, sometimes dramatically. But better to be slowed down by a tree this way than to hit a pedestrian. So that was what we looked at in the downtown plan. Now, what was wonderful and coincidental, perhaps, but as the plan was completed, as the walkability study was completed, Devon Energy showed up and said, hey, we want to build this 50-story tower in the heart of your downtown. And I showed up in the headquarters of Devon Energy, and the city manager was there. Mayor Cornett was incredibly supportive throughout this whole thing. But I had to deal with a city manager who was quite conservative. And, the thunder were arriving. And ahead of this major company. And I actually remember the city manager pointing his finger at me and saying, I will not be stuck in traffic after a thunder game. And so we really had to satisfy them in conjunction with all this growth. The plan then, when this tower arrived, it was generating about $200 million in tax increment. And they said, how can we spend that money? And they said, let's rebuild the streets, 40 blocks. And they did most of them, not all, but 40 blocks of streets in our downtown core with that money, from building edge to building edge, new landscape, new sidewalks, and everything. They hired the wonderful firm opposite of Jim Burnett, the landscape architecture firm, who then brought me on as a sub. Jim Burnett ran the show. Jarek was the project manager, both still very active, doing great projects all around the country. My job was to design the curb to curb. How many lanes? What are the bike facilities, et cetera. I was able to eliminate, based on traffic counts, 1/3 of the driving lanes. We were able to double the amount of on-street parking, and there was no bike network before. We ended up with a pretty decent one afterwards. Of course, the city had to do a traffic study. They hired their normal modelers, a private company who love predicting traffic, who rejected the plan and said it would be instant gridlock. Fortunately, the project manager at the city, the engineer in public works at the city, was a very open-minded, smart person named Laura Story. I'm showing you pages from a memo that she wrote subsequent to the completion of the project. And she notes that the initial results reflected unacceptable level of service in the proposed grid system. The suggestion was to add a whole bunch of turn lanes, add third lanes. However, planning staff objected to the preliminary traffic report. Planning staff and consultants presented information about what a successful downtown functioned and felt like. And we did another thing, which was for $5,000, which we took out of our fee. We got a competing traffic study done, which is an unheard of price, by this wonderful engineer named Troy Russ. He required us to put in like one left turn lane, I think, on one street. And otherwise, we were successful in the effort. This is Laura Story's conclusion, realizing there are more users than just drivers on these streets. So here's some of the outcomes. 4-lane two-way becomes a 2-lane two-way. 3-lane one-way becomes a 2-lane two-way. A 4-lane one-way becomes a 2-lane two-way plus tram, and that's another thing that the mayor succeeded in getting in the city. Here's the biggest street from the downtown, now looks like this. And of course, the landscape is fantastic because that was redone as well. So that is the outcome that came from strong leadership, good engineers, great collaboration. However, the point I want to make is that that was the first. And now, this is a list of just the cities I've worked on that have eliminated multi-lane one-way streets. And by the way, there's nothing really wrong with one-lane one-way streets, but multi-lane one-way streets are extremely dangerous. These are cities I've worked on since Oklahoma City. There are others that we're working on now, but these are the ones that have done, or in the last case, just this week, just Tuesday night, approved a plan in Scranton, Pennsylvania to radically alter their downtown. If you zoom in, I was surprised by this outcome. It took about 3 years for them to convince PennDOT, Pennsylvania DOT, who has authority over all these streets. We did not have a state in our way in Oklahoma because the city owned all the streets. In Pennsylvania, it's different. These are the 4 major one-ways running through the heart of Scranton. You can't even make a loop around the courthouse square because they're all kind of one-ways in the wrong direction. This is what it feels like. We just completed a plan to revert those to two-way travel. We are eliminating 19 stop signals in favor of stop signs. When we did the Oklahoma City study, I did not know the data about how a stop sign, all-way stop sign, is 68% safer for a pedestrian than a signal. So that's the new thing we're doing when we revert our streets to two-way travel, that often allows us to eliminate stop signs. And we're doing that in Scranton as well. And then we're road dieting streets in the same way we did in Oklahoma City. So for example, a typical street like this, you see the 4 lanes each way, is becoming this. This was just approved. It has state approval. It's fully funded. It'll be done in a year in downtown Scranton. So Oklahoma City really started the ball rolling. This is now a scope of work that we bring to cities all around the country. It all started here, and I'm excited for the mayor to tell you more about his approach to the work that we did. I always like to end with resources. I hope you guys have seen or will read Walkable City, which is the gateway drug into this conversation. It's really meant for general audiences, so there's nothing in there that you will find too technical. If you want to get more technical, but still, I hope, readable, there's this book, Walkable City Rules. It's more for people who are doing the work. Ellen mentioned the TED Talks. There's 2 of them, both under my name. One is more the why of walkability, why we should make our places more walkable. The other is like what I've told you today, but of course, a little more varied and not just about Oklahoma City. And then finally, because there are students here, I teach a class at Harvard every summer. It's just 2 days. Anyone can go. I recommend that. Because it's Harvard, it's a bit expensive. And if you don't have the money and want to spend 9 hours with me online, these 7 classes just up on planetizen.com are like taking a whole semester of planning. They add up to 9 hours, and you can find them there. So you can find all these resources and more at our website, which is Speck Dempsey. That's my firm. We're in Brookline, Massachusetts. And with that, I have a couple of things. One, since Ellen had you take your phone out, one new thing that I'm doing now, starting last week, is when I give a talk, I share my slides. These slides are not copyrighted. You can't publish them, but you can use them however you see fit. So if you scan this QR code, you will get an opportunity to ask us for our slides, my slides, and I will send them to you. Secondly, since you have your phone out, go to plannerspledge.org. If you want to support the work we're doing, you will read the Planner's Pledge and you might want to sign it. The Planner's Pledge is an effort to reform the planning profession by introducing a well-defined quality standard that has until now been conspicuously missing. It's a longer story, but it's a new movement that we're working on, and we hope you will sign it. It looks like this. That's where we are, plannerspledge.org. And I've taken enough of your time. So thank you for your attention. I will stop sharing my screen and we'll hand it back to Mick.
Jeff was a change agent. And, Jeff came into the most, the least walkable city in America and was willing, and some might say anxious, to tell us all the things that Oklahoma City was doing wrong. And he had to whittle it down because it was a long list, I'm sure, from his association. For me to come in and speak to an audience like this on a topic like this is I have to take a step back because I have absolutely no training in anything I'm about to talk about. I travel the world now. I speak about urban planning. I speak about architecture and engineers and public health. And I really don't know anything about any of those things. At least I'm not scientifically or educationally trained to speak about any of those things. I'm a businessman. I'm a journalist. If I have a skill set, it's I know how to talk to people. And sometimes I can take something that's relatively complicated and break it down and speak and communicate it to an audience that might make sense to them. And so from that standpoint, after spending 20 years in television broadcasting and turning my attention to local politics, I was able to kind of lead a city through a transformation. And in many ways, Oklahoma City's transformation was becoming probably the worst example of urban sprawl and a car-centric mentality to what I think is a very admirable and maybe one of the best and most walkable cities in the United States. No city in America has come as far as fast as Oklahoma City in a lot of ways, but that's partially because we had so far to go. Oklahoma City probably had the worst economy and the worst downtown in 1990. And today we have one of the best. We started by investing in the downtown core, and started building some public amenities, libraries, arenas, baseball stadiums, and were under the mistaken. I had a mistaken idea that would draw people to the inner city. What we didn't realize at the time, and I can see in retrospect quite clearly, is that we had still the least walkable city downtown. And so a pedestrian did not feel welcome once they had arrived to take in some of these publicly paid amenities. Jeff mentioned the 5-lane one-way streets, which were pretty much universal in our downtown core. And I told you I wasn't going to stand up, but I'm going to stand up. This is what it was like if you were trying to cross a street in downtown Oklahoma City. Remember, there's 5 lanes, and there weren't that many pedestrians, partially because you would drive anywhere you needed to go. And so you would wait a seemingly considerable amount of time to get the don't walk sign to allow you to walk. And you would take a step off the curb and another step and perhaps a third, and then you would see it start to flash. And you still have 4.5 lanes to go. And so now you're losing confidence in the system. So you start walking faster. And then you start to jog. And usually, just as the light turned green, you would leap to the curb, and the cars, which were by this time piling up, waiting for this inconsiderate person who's a pedestrian to clear out of their way so they could zoom past you. That is the experience that Oklahoma City was leaving with the pedestrian for decades. And my enlightenment in all of these areas came really quite haphazardly. In 2004, I was allowed to go to what's called the Mayor's Institute of Design. And it's where mayors bring a somewhat complicated planning exercise to a group of professionals. And so this is a group of consultants who come in, and it's advice you could never afford to get in any other way. And so I brought this opportunity. We were moving an interstate highway several blocks from the core of downtown to kind of the edge of downtown. And we were going to build a park and perhaps the convention center next to it. And that's really about all I knew. And I was a relatively new mayor, so I didn't know much other than the suburban lifestyle that we had in Oklahoma City was really all I knew and was comfortable with. And I'd grown up there. And so I really was probably the least urbanist mayor in America. And I'm getting this advice from a number of influential academics that were urban planners, and they're telling me about this park and things I should look for. And part of the element of that was that the old interstate corridor was going to be turned into an at-grade boulevard that the city would be able to design and have as a downtown street, while the interstate had been moved 5 blocks to the south. And Jeff Speck was one of the academics. And this is where I first was introduced to some of his philosophies. And Jeff said, Mayor, of all the things that you're looking at and considering here, I think the most important thing you should be thinking about is how you're going to design that street. And I promise you, I had never known that a street was designed. Every street in Oklahoma City looked exactly the same. It was really wide. Jeff talked about the width of the lanes. The idea of street design was completely foreign to me. And I don't know what my reaction was, but I'm sure whatever I said following his remark only made me look more foolish than I already felt. But over the course of the next 2-3 years, I continued to follow up with Jeff as he kind of moved around in a couple of different endeavors. And he continued to give me ideas. And I continued to learn more about how Oklahoma City had developed this car-centric attitude, and that it wasn't necessarily permanent. It could be changed. Now, it took a lot to change it. It took a change of the person who was doing public works. And it took, perhaps most importantly, as Jeff pointed out, Devon Energy's willingness to give up a couple of $100 million of TIF financing to benefit the rest of downtown and not just the area that was right around their skyscraper. My role was really to convince city staff, city's leadership, and ultimately the entire city of Oklahoma City, who had to pay for these types of improvements, that it was worthwhile and while we were doing it. Now, in the midst of all of that, on another tangent, I'm going to come back to the subject I'm talking about now. Oklahoma City was also starting to get some attention by what I will call the lists. Now, you've all seen them. It's websites or magazines that come up with the best city to do this or best city to do that. And we all love to look at these lists because we want to see where our city is and on these different lists. And I was kind of traveling the city and in some cases the nation, discussing with people that Oklahoma City was starting to become a community that people should take notice of. In other words, it would be like best city to get a job, and Oklahoma City would be like number 26. But we'd never really been on a list before, any list. And so I thought it was kind of cool, and I was using it to validate Oklahoma City's ascension, even to our own citizens who were slow to believe that Oklahoma City was starting to do things at a much higher value proposition than had been done before. We had been too value conscious for years. We had never really paid attention to design, and we had a city that was very forgettable as a result. Nonetheless, finally came out the list of the most obese cities in the country. And there we were. I think we were number 2. Now, I like to point out we were on that list with a lot of other really cool places. Miami, Houston, Dallas, Atlanta, New Orleans. I mean, the list of cities that were also on the list of the most obese cities weren't generally a list of cities that you would be embarrassed to be associated with. But nonetheless, I was the mayor of one of the most obese cities in the country. I didn't really know how to defend it or attack it. And, the media was asking me what I was going to do about it. And I had absolutely no idea, had, again, no training in public health or awareness. But I did know I was overweight. And so I started losing weight myself. And because I had become an obese mayor during the time. Everybody wants to feed the mayor. And the mayor was eating. And so I was gaining like 10 pounds a year the first couple of years I was in office, and realized I was going to be a really large mayor if I kept this up. So I lost 40 pounds over 40 weeks. I just stopped eating as much. I'd always exercised, but I just ate too much. I was eating like 3,000 calories a day. And so the weight came off, but I started examining during that time period when I was losing weight, I started examining our city, and I was trying to figure out, why do we have such a problem with obesity? What is it about us? And I realized, I came to the conclusion that we had built an incredible quality of life if you happen to be a car. If you were a car, the best place in the world for you to live was Oklahoma City. It's as if we had instructed our civil engineers that their number one priority in life, from the time they wake up to the time they go to sleep, their number one priority is to see how fast they can get a car from here to here. And they were really good at it. I mean, traffic flowed through Oklahoma City. In rush hour traffic, you could get a speeding ticket. We had the most incredible capacity. We had huge interstate highways, 3 interstate highways intersecting in Oklahoma City, a bunch of state highways, large roads, which Jeff described, with a tremendous capacity. I wasn't around when any of that was designed, but that's the city I kind of inherited as an adult. And as a result, it had led to a cheap land. It had led to a place where fast food restaurants could thrive. Ultimately, I ran into the CEO of Taco Bell, and I was explaining to him my situation, and he said, well, that explains it then. And I said, what do you mean explains it? He goes, that explains why we have 45 Taco Bells in Oklahoma City. I said, who counts their Taco Bells? I said, we have 45 Taco Bells? He goes, yeah. I said, well, how many people go to Taco Bell every day? He says, just a minute. And he starts typing it in. And there was like 20-something thousand people in Oklahoma City were going to Taco Bell every day. And that's just one fast food restaurant. And I realized that, this was an example of why Oklahoma City had this obesity crisis. We had created this culture of fast food restaurants and overeating and a lack of exercise. Now, the other thing is, not only were we not walkable, people would never have even considered walking. In other words, if you were going to go around the block, you would have gotten the car keys. I remember there was an institute of health who was rating cities and how the built environment addressed health and wellness. And one of the questions they asked my citizens and other citizens around the country is, do you live within a 10-minute walk of a park? Sounds like a general question. There's nothing wrong when you think about the question, except in Oklahoma City, no one would ever even know how far they could walk in 10 minutes because no one had walked 10 minutes. They walked from their house to their car, and that is as far as anyone would walk. Walk for transportation was nowhere on our radar screen for anyone. And so the whole idea of measuring these types of things was completely oblivious to the average person growing up in Oklahoma City, including me. And so what I realized through my conversations with Jeff, my own enlightenment on how the built environment affects public health, all of these things start to collide by about my 5th or 6th year in office. And that's when Devon Energy decides they will help us redesign all of our downtown streets. And I using all the political capital I could inside City Hall to get them to hire Jeff Speck. And Jeff comes in as a change agent and starts, as you saw, informing or illustrating to our city leadership just how many things we had been doing that were not in our own best interest. As Jeff mentioned, we had some enlightened people in our own planning department, but they had never been given any sort of direction that would allow them to do the type of work that I think they all felt like they were trained and believed in doing. Finally, in one of my State of the City addresses that time, when I knew city employees are all watching, I said, we have designed this city around cars. What if we start designing it around people? How does that make it look different? And the results are obvious. If you go to Oklahoma City now, traffic still moves quite briskly through the city, but we have, I believe, the most walkable downtown grid in the United States. If there is one out there that has an urban core, amongst cities with an urban core, if there's one that's more walkable than ours, I'd like to see it. You might grab New York City as being extremely walkable, and it is. But it's hard to compare Oklahoma City with New York City on any level. But any city that has been designed around the automobile and then retroactively tried to go in and refit the built environment, I think Oklahoma City is probably the best example of that I've seen. And Jeff Speck, through his teaching me figuring out how to talk about it, and then Jeff going in and actually doing the hard work, I think, is really kind of the explanation point on the story that we're communicating today.
Fantastic. What a journey. So I'm going to, Jeff, can you turn your camera back on now? So I'd like to now have a conversation, lead a conversation with the two of you and invite you to comment to each other. But I wanted to start with asking both of you to just sort of offer advice to your cohorts about implementing change. You've told us the story that each of you went through, but in terms of, Mick, what advice do you have for other folks in public service about, not everybody gets to go to the Mayor's Institute and City Design, great as it is, but how to convince the public to support change. While as Jeff, it's what advice do you have for private consultants who are trying to translate these ideas and aspirations into built change? And how do you convince folks like Mick? So, Mick, why don't you start? I mean,
Okay.
Advice for folks in public service.
Let me illustrate it this way. When it comes to change, there's really three types of people. There are people that will say, I don't like change. Don't change it. If you change it, I'm going to be mad. Then you change something, you find out they were right. They're furious. They don't like you anymore. You've upset them. There's another group of people that will tell you they love change. Change it. If you change it, we're going to be happier than we are now. So please change it. Then when you change it, you find out they were wrong. They're angry. They're upset. They're throwing things at you. They can't believe that you changed it. And they completely forget that they told you they thought it would be a good idea to change it. There's a third group of people that will tell you they love change and they really do love change when you're coming. The problem is that group is extinct. That group exists nowhere in the world. And so I exaggerate to prove a point. If you're going to change anything, do not expect it to be embraced with any high level of a percentage. Almost certainly somebody is going to find something wrong with your great idea for change. You've just got to figure out if it's worth the risk and the opportunity to make these changes. I can't tell you how many mayors I have visited with in Oklahoma City and in their cities and talked to them about converting one-way streets to two-way streets. They have floated the idea and have never wanted to bring that idea up in their city again. The number of negative comments they get just completely flabbergast them. And in our city, we've never woken up one day and said, gee, I wish we had more one-way streets in Oklahoma City. We got rid of basically all of them. And it had a dramatic change in the way our downtown city feels. And so if I had to pick one thing to tell one of my cohorts in the city, it's don't be afraid to do that, because once it's done, it will have a meaningful effect and people will wonder why we didn't do it earlier.
I sure hope that folks from the city of Atlanta are listening. I've lived here 25 years. We've been talking about converting the one-way streets for 25 years, and they're still there.
Yeah, I saw them.
Jeff, your turn.
Well, it's really fun to hear the mayor say things that I like to say that he hasn't heard from me, but we've kind of reached the same conclusions independently. There's a line in my book, Walkable City Rules, I believe, that says, all I can tell you about these one-way reversions is that no one has ever regretted one. And that's just the story. The mayor said another thing, which is what I often say, which is, Ellen, you know very well, I'm one of a big group of people who's doing this work. And there's a lot of us who are good at it. And I've seen it as my role, like the mayor described, to be someone who can speak to general audiences and communicate these ideas. And I've seen my role in this profession over the last 30 years, since I first heard Andres Stwani speak, that was my aha moment, when Andres spoke about towns versus sprawl and what the differences were between them and how it wasn't legal to build towns anymore and what we could do about that. And that book became Suburban Nation. But from then on, I've made it my business to hear the smartest people explain the most important aspects of the urban environment and taking really good notes. And my books are basically, amalgamations of that advice from lots of different people. So I've seen it as my role to collect it, to find the best way to explain each of these issues, whether it's parallel parking. Every time I explain parallel parking, I'm going to say, it's an essential barrier of steel that protects the curb from moving vehicles. And I've memorized 1,000 phrases like that. After Walkable City came out, I started listening to it on airplanes because it helped me get to sleep. But I literally have made an effort to figure out the best way to sell, to use a simple term, the best way to sell all these concepts and then just to make it my own, even though most of it wasn't my own originally, right? So don't underestimate the power of speaking to audiences in the ways that they can understand, using data, as you heard me do, and sharing success stories. The Oklahoma story, I told the Oklahoma City story in New Albany, Indiana, and we reverted an entire downtown in a fairly big town from one-way travel to two-way travel. And of course, a lot of people fought it and they sat on it for 3 years. And then one summer they did it all in a month. And people say it's never been safer. It's never been more walkable. It's never been more successful. But the, sharing success stories has made it easier and easier and easier. And this work just gets easier, which is a really great experience.
Well, of course, the part that doesn't get easier is funding it. And so
this got harder.
Yeah, exactly. It's getting harder and harder these days. So, Mick, do you think, yes, you had the TIF coming from Devon Energy, the tax increment from that increased tax value of building a very tall building. But at the same time, you've been able to get your city to pass a 1 penny sales tax. Do you think your success with putting the city on a diet and losing a million pounds, it sort of does, even though they're disconnected, not immediately connected, but does that give you the credibility, somehow the likability to help get people to agree to spend a sales tax?
Yeah, let me put a ribbon on the obesity story. So when I studied it, I talked about how I realized that we were a city built around cars and automobiles. I also realized that obesity was a topic that people weren't comfortable discussing. And, it was as if our unannounced strategy to combating obesity was to ignore it and hope it would go away. And you could see where that was getting us. You could just look at our children and see that obesity was going to continue to be a problem in Oklahoma City for a long, long time to come. And so I didn't know the best way to get people to accept the fact that they needed to pay more attention to their health. But I did know that the first step had to be talking about it. And so I really created a stunt. I went to the zoo. I stood in front of the elephants, called a press conference, and I announced that I was putting the entire city on a diet and we were going to lose 1 million pounds. And that's when all hell broke loose. There was the typical response. There was people grabbing the city's constitution to see if the mayor had the ability to put everybody on a diet. Some people in the media were actually questioning whether or not I was exerting my authority a little bit too strong. But the bottom line in all of that was that we got a conversation going. We had a website, as she mentioned, 47,000 people ultimately signed up. They chronicled their weight loss journey. We lost 1 million pounds over the next 3 years. I can't tell you that there weren't 47,000 other people who gained 1 million pounds. What I can tell you is that almost everyone in the city knew that the mayor had put them on a diet, and people were discussing obesity for probably the first time in their lives. Husbands and wives, parents and children, neighbors over the back fence, business owners and employees, church pastors and their congregations. Obesity became the talk of the town after the mayor put the entire city on a diet and asked everyone to think about losing weight. And so what that had happened before I started looking at Project 180 and Jeff's work. And what we were able to convince people at that point, because it was just a really small step forward, I was communicating that the built environment, it has a direct result on the city's public health and our obesity problem. We had virtually no sidewalks in the community, virtually no bike lanes. Biking for transportation was not even on the radar screen. There was some biking for recreation. But So we ended up building hundreds of miles of sidewalks, completed our jogging and biking trail master plan, and made this change to the downtown streets that Jeff has described. So really a generational change in the way that we looked at our built environment and how it affected public health. And so the obesity messaging and the better streets messaging kind of happen in parallel worlds, but they all collided into this in this very wonderful moment in the early part of, say, 2010, 2011, 2012, when my political capital was also, at one of its highest points. So I had the political capital to try and force through all these changes to a city that was, reluctant, to say the least, to these types of changes. But ultimately, obviously very worthwhile, and only have contributed to the general expansion of our economy, which has been one of the most remarkable in the country over that time frame.
Well, and it is remarkable to get, to get the buy-in and get the funding. Jeff, so as you're working with other communities, are you finding other innovative funding mechanisms? What is there a pattern? How are these things being funded?
Well, the audience might be interested to know, if they haven't heard, that the Trump administration, through the Department of Transportation, recently, as kind of a rebuttal to the Safe Streets for All program and other work that was done in the previous administration, has really gotten, into a surprising level of detail, and apparently know more about the work we're trying to do than I had anticipated, in essentially making a public statement that essentially road diets any reduction of capacity of any street, whether it was oversized or not, are discouraged, and moreover will not be funded by the federal government. My reaction to that was muted, because in fact most of the projects I've done over the years have not received or required federal funding, but certainly a lot of the good projects that have been done nationally have. Many receive state funding. Many, do it locally, as the MAPS program accomplished so much, along with the Devon Energy TIF in Oklahoma City. I would say, though, that what you didn't get from me today is what I often show in my lectures. I show the Oklahoma City story, and then I say, but this is what you do if you have money. But what if you don't have money? Mm-hmm. And I say, don't rebuild, restripe. And then I show people Cedar Rapids. And Cedar Rapids is a downtown, no match for Oklahoma City in terms of size or population, but it was essentially instead of a 40-block core, it was about a 25-block core. And they had, nice small blocks, and theoretically they could have had small streets, but their typical street was also, half their streets were 4-lane one-ways. And we did a very similar exercise subsequent to Oklahoma City, and they budgeted it at zero. But what they said was, these streets all need to be repaved over the next 8 years. So we're going to repave them to this standard. And when the 8 years are over, your plan will be complete. And in fact, that's what happened. So they didn't move any curbs. And I always tell cities, you can rebuild, for the price of rebuilding 1 or 2 streets, you can restripe most of a downtown. And so that's the best way to make your money go further. It's not going to beautify. In Oklahoma City, I think a lot of the benefits came also from the incredible investment in landscape and tree cover and irrigation. But the typical plan that we do leaves the curbs alone and just does restriping. And often that restriping is done as part of routine maintenance and doesn't need to be budgeted. So that's a little encouraging.
The disruption to our downtown streets was pretty massive, because and one of the ways I tried to get people to look at it at the time, because literally it was hard to drive in downtown for about 2 years. And I said, we're calling it Project 180 because we're trying to do 180 things all at once. And at least that provided some levity, to the situation. This will all be over eventually. But we were digging up all of our downtown streets, I don't know, 10, 12, 20 feet deep. These streets had never been excavated before. We didn't even know what was under there. And who doesn't like to look at a big hole in the ground anyway? I mean, it was quite the attraction. But when it was all over, I mean, the city was transformed. But I can't tell you that it's not without some discomfort in the short term, because it was costly. As Jeff points out, the price of paint is not all that expensive. You can make a lot of improvements, but to do what we did, it was a massive reconstruction.
So I'm going to kind of quickly, but get into a little on the impacts of the project. And Jeff, you provided some great data focusing on the cars and the safety and things. But Mick, I'd like to ask you, did the city, once you got the streets changed, did the city then also take steps to infill vacant storefronts, attract more residents downtown? Or did that all just sort of happen as a result of a less car-dominated, more people-centered streets? Or was the city proactive? Were there programs?
Yeah, I would say for the most part, it just happened. But, keep in mind, how far we had to go. If you go back, say, 30, 35 years in Oklahoma City, there's virtually no hotels, no housing, no restaurants. I mean, downtown was dead. And so there wasn't much disharmony to businesses or people that lived there because there was none of that. And one of the advantages I think Oklahoma City had is that what I call the advantage of desperation, in that we were calling for change to a community that knew we had to do something different. If you're trying to communicate an idea of change, it's very helpful if the people receiving that message understand that there's a problem. I've run into a lot of mayors who tell me about something they're doing and they're excited about it. And they tell me, and it's a little bit, kind of a very, very specific change that they're instituting. And I'll say, well, do the people in your city know that's a problem? And they'll say, no, that's one of the interesting things is they don't even know that's a problem. And I'm thinking to myself, because I don't want to call them out, you're going to have trouble instituting change if people don't understand there's a problem. You're trying to fix something that they don't know is broken. In Oklahoma City, we had the advantage that people knew we had to do something different. And as a result, U.S. News and World Report just this summer took the 30 largest cities in the United States and ranked them on the best places to live. And Oklahoma City was ranked number 1.
Congratulations.
Well,
to both of you. Absolutely.
I do that just to point out the fact that if they had done it 30, 35 years ago, we would have been number 30. There's no question in my mind.
Yeah. So, all right. My last question before we go to Q&A. So this is a little prompt, Slido.com 1050566. Get your questions into Slido. But Jeff, I want to talk about future street retrofits. Are there any details that you would modify if you were doing Oklahoma City today relative to, say, e-bikes, robo-taxis, climate change, you name it? Or do the fundamentals just stay the same?
Well, there's definitely things we would do differently now for the present versus back then because we have more rope now and more authority to do better standards. So with apologies to the mayor, because of what we were able to do at the time, and for example, we certainly knew back then that we preferred separated bike lanes, right? We would have rather pulled the parking off the curb, put a little door zone buffer in there, and then had the bike lanes against the curb. That wasn't something that was a bridge too far in Oklahoma City in 2009, right? Yes. A lot of cities in which we are now able to do that are realizing that there's a better standard yet. And if you go to Seattle or come this way to Boston or Cambridge or Somerville, you're going to see the bike lanes are up on the curb. The new bike lanes that we're building are out of the street. We have a little buffer against the curb for the car doors. Then you have the bike lane. Then you have the tree zone. Then you have the pedestrian zone. And that's a standard that I witnessed in Berlin in the 1990s, right? So we've been slowly catching up to the best practices in terms of those standards. You meet cities where they're at and you do the best you can at the time. When I show the Oklahoma City slides that include a door zone bike lane, sometimes people bring that to my attention and I'm like, we did the best that we could. And I would say that as recently as 5 years ago, when I wrote Walkable City Rules, I talked about how to do a door zone bike lane. And now I will never advise anyone to do a door zone bike lane. We don't do that. We just don't do them anymore. So bike lanes are the thing that's probably advanced the fastest. Just as a little note about e-bikes and micromobility, there is no room for another set of lanes in our streets. We've got the fast-moving car lanes, we've got the pedestrian sidewalks, and we've got bike lanes. While we hate to advocate for enforcement, there may need to be an enforcement component to getting e-bikes, delivery vehicles, and other folks to behave in bike lanes, because we're not adding we're not adding a fourth option to our streets. We all know that's an issue. I make a point in some lectures I give, including one that Mayor Cornett introduced me at the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and you can find it online. My name at the U.S. Conference of Mayors. I spoke. It's a funny story where the mayor, when he was the chairman of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, thought it would be great to have me address a plenary of American mayors. And he called me up probably 2 weeks before the event and said, Jeff, I've got some bad news. And I was like, oh no, like I don't get a half an hour anymore. I don't get to talk at all. And he's like, all the mayors want to hear about is autonomous vehicles. This was about what, Mayor, 6 years ago, maybe?
10, almost 10.
Almost 10 years ago. Oh my gosh. And so I did the research and came up with, I think, 10 rules for mayors about how to deal with autonomous vehicles. And I won't take you through them, but the biggest one is basically that you have to legislate with lanes. It's very clear that anything you do that reduces the cost of driving or increases the convenience of driving is basically going to become another sprawl bomb and another incentive for more driving, including the car that you take to work and then you send home so that your spouse can use it. And the ZOVs, the zero occupancy vehicles, that are going to be buzzing around all our streets, gumming them up. And there's going to be, contrary to the mythology, that there's going to be some incredibly efficient swarm of vehicles that's going to make the streets much more efficient. What we're going to see is a lot more potential congestion, and cities are going to be tempted to add capacity. And given the limitations that cities feel or have imposed upon them by states or the federal government about making rules in their own jurisdiction, it'll be very hard for cities to make any rules to limit this sort of new technology. So I say legislate with lanes. If autonomous vehicle producers really think that they're going to reduce the need for lanes, then sure as heck don't give them any more. And the number of lanes you have in your street, we all know, there's this myth of the traffic study. Even the most enlightened traffic engineers I work with think that we have the number of lanes in our cities because of the number of cars we have in our cities. It's the exact opposite. And we all need to learn that. We have the number of cars in our cities because of the number of lanes we have in our cities. And that's the power that mayors and others hold over the kind of cities they want to have.
I agree. All right. We're now going to shift to Q&A, and I'm delighted to introduce JT Taylor. JT, why don't you come on up? JT is becoming the new co-host of Redesigning Cities. And yes, I'll let JT introduce himself a little bit, but he's also, we're going to co-do the Q&A. And maybe, Mick, I think we should move you to this side. And JT,
I'm not comfortable being so giant.
Well, but you are, Jeff. Just get used to it. So, JT and I are just going to go kind of back and forth. So, JT, introduce yourself, and you toss out the first question.
Hi, everyone. John Taylor, Faculty of Civil and
you're going to be
Environmental
talking.
Engineering. Very happy to be here. And thank you both for that very inspiring talk, and Ellen, the great initial discussion. I've been looking at the questions as they're coming in. Make sure you're, voting on which ones you like. As I look at the top upvoted questions, one of them is a really interesting one about the stitch. And so there is discussion here about covering up the connector, basically the highway here, and creating a public space above that. Do you have thoughts on highway capping projects like this?
Is that directed to me?
I'm looking at you. I'm thinking you're sitting pretty close to Olmsted in Brookline.
So they're very expensive, right? They're worth doing if the space can really be populated. Probably the most effective stitch I know is just a bridge called the Cap at Union Station that's in Columbus, Ohio. And you guys probably know it, but it's basically a Ponte Vecchio. It's basically a street with shops on either side, where they rebuilt just a bridge over a highway, but they rebuilt it completely contained. So you don't even know you're crossing the highway when you're on it. It did not take a lot of investment, very limited investment, to make that happen because it was just alongside the street. You have a similar version without shops, but it's quite lovely that I show people approaching Georgia Tech from Midtown, if I'm not mistaken, which has trees and lawn and other things on it. That's a kind of a second version of that. There's Clyde Warren Park is the most famous one. We're doing a plan right now for Uptown Dallas, which is adjacent to that site. And I forget the price, but it was extremely expensive just to build the deck. But it really works because it is activated, right? The park is full of stuff. It's well programmed. It has buildings that serve food and drink in it. I think a big mistake that cities make that the smart developers don't make is they won't make you shouldn't make a civic space unless you also have a commitment to program it, right? You guys probably know Avalon in Alpharetta, which is a real success story in terms of, at least as a productive and economic engine. It's a mixed use kind of town center surrounded by sprawl, although downtown Alpharetta is a pretty nice little gem. But I believe they have more events programmed for their green at Avalon than there are days in the year. And there's one staffer who does nothing but that. So, I would say these public spaces are great, but you have to make a commitment to keep them active.
Yeah.
I think Jeff's right. My most recent assignment is I'm a senior urban fellow with the Urban Land Institute, and ULI called me in to serve on a panel at Hofstra University, which is on Long Island, a very car-centric university, a big commuter school that would prefer to have more on-campus students. And they have a turnpike that goes right through the middle of their campus. And the idea that you're discussing would be perfect there. But as Jeff points out, it'd be very, very expensive. And, if there are other alternatives, that's usually the one that's going to win out.
So we have a question, Mick, for you. Great talk. In terms of fighting obesity, what other measures besides road diets and walkability were also considered? And which did any ideas about which are the most or least effective? That's a question from one of my PhD students where his dissertation is very much on food access and all the different ways in which we encourage and discourage.
Well, I think in Oklahoma City's case, we just developed a culture that embraced the topic. And so, for instance, our restaurants, our top chefs in the community all decided that they could come up with healthier options. And so the menus would have, the mayor's special or something like that on there. And so it just became something that was more culturally expected. And our employers embraced it with their employees and started, I hear some feedback, so I'm going to move over this way. And so insurance plans and health and wellness opportunity, all of that. So it really, I think in our city, the cultural experience and improvement was probably very, very meaningful. I don't know that I can tell you we have less of an obesity problem. I'm pretty sure we do, but those things are hard to measure. But the big success story is that we take it seriously and we're working on it, and there's an expectation that people need to do better.
Thank you. This question, I think, is for you, Mayor Cornett. How does the fire department react when you convert two-way streets to parking on both sides?
Yeah, it's real easy in a city to let the fire marshal and the fire department determine a lot of things over public works ideas. Like, fire departments don't like traffic circles and roundabouts either. And they don't like narrowing streets because, if a first responder makes a wrong turn, it's hard to turn around. All those things are true. But what I try to remind them and other people is that the concepts that Jeff speaks about and these concepts that we're talking about today, they're making a safer city. And they're so concerned about being a first respondent and dealing with an emergency, they don't realize a safer city 365 days a year is really in everybody's best interest. And sometimes I think it's hard for them to focus on that because they're so concerned about the immediate emergency that they're called upon to address.
Thank you.
Jeff, to me, the answer to this question is obvious, but we I think it's absolutely something that the School of Architecture needs to hear. So someone has asked, how can architects contribute to creating walkable cities?
Well, I mean, how much time do we have? So the founders of the New Urbanist movement and myself as well, we were all trained as architects. And in fact, I believe it was the reintroduction of architectural thinking into the city planning profession, which is responsible for the changes that we've seen over the last 25 years or so. There's a lot to be done. Okay, where to start? The first thing I would say is that when an architect, the way we're trained in school, and I went to a school that probably was particularly guilty of this, but the way we're trained in school is that when an architect gets a urban design scale project, they tend to think of it as a large architecture project. So you get a site that might hold, 10 buildings. Well, of course, I'm one person with one style, so the buildings should all look like each other. Like, wrong. That's just wrong. No one, as Jane Jacobs said, no one walks from repetition to repetition or from sameness to sameness, even when the effort expended is minimal. It's a real job of architects to make sure that there's variety as they move across a site or down a block. And if they can't, with honesty, create that variety themselves, then they need to hand it out to their friends. One of the things we did at DPZ, and we still do at Speck Dempsey, when we have a large project, is we distribute the architecture to many different architects. At the building scale, and I love talking about demise lines, Ellen, but at the building scale,
Explain what a demise line is.
Yeah,
Jeff.
So we have learned about this concept. I can't say I invented it. I know I didn't, called the demise line. And the demise line is when you have a very large building, which, by the way, is very normal these days. The typical new apartment building in an urban area is what we call a Dallas donut, where you have a 2 to 3 bay parking deck, which is maybe 300 feet long, being wrapped and hidden brilliantly. This is another thing architects can and must do, is hide the parking. But the parking is being hidden brilliantly at the middle of the lot. And you end up with a block which is probably about 300 by 500 feet in size, and what's effectively one giant building surrounding it, with some single-loaded corridors masking the parking deck and then some U-shaped courtyard, double-loaded corridor buildings on either end. It's very standard. Go to uptown Dallas and look from the air and you'll see the birthplace of the Dallas donut. Well, that is effectively one building, but nobody wants to see a 500-foot long building. They don't even want to see a 300-foot long building. And so what experts have, what certain architects have become expert at, and I'll point at David Schwarz, I'll point at Elkis Manfredi, I'll point at a lot of the firms that are doing these projects, and we put them in our plans, is we put demise lines in the plans where you have to pretend that your building is multiple buildings. And so you draw a line, you say, let's imagine that we didn't have the gargantuan investments in capital that currently drive our housing production market, and that we used to develop the way that we developed the way that we used to, which is lots of chipmunks working together rather than one big dinosaur or elephant, as the mayor would have it. And what would that outcome look like? And it's a very effective tool. And if you can't convincingly, Torty Gallis does it, all the new urbanists do it. If you can't convincingly make a very big building look like lots of smaller buildings, then you shouldn't be doing that kind of work. I should say that it's a remedy not just to boredom, but to what's become standard multifamily apartment 4/1 or 5/1 style, which is this incredible bricolage, collage of 16 different materials and 17 different window types and bay types. And the typical building these days is a complete mess because there's this need of the architect to break it up into something that a review board will approve. Well, don't break it up everywhere. Break it into individual buildings, and then each building can be simple. And I know I've rambled, but I'll add one more thing, which is that when you build a building with 500 windows that are all the same, and it just so happens that your window manufacturer chose the wrong gasket, then you have 500 windows to replace. So there's actually real economic sense to breaking a building into multiple parts as well, which is that things that fail will not fail universally.
Thank you. I have a question here from the audience for the mayor. Mayor, you spoke about how change is the most universally unpopular. How did you achieve unpopular change and be reelected for 4 terms?
Well, I picked my spots. You don't try to change everything at once. And, rehearsed my talking points over and over and tried to concentrate on change that's going to have the most meaningful impact. And you mentioned my 4 terms as mayor. I think overall, counting initiatives that I helped on and school bond issues that I was in front of, I think there were somewhere between 10 and 12 elections where I was out front trying to convince people to vote a certain way. And you can imagine how many times I had to go into public meetings or neighborhood meetings and try and convince people to either elect me or vote for something that I was asking them to vote for. And I noticed there was a pattern. And at the end of these meetings, I would see someone at the back of the room that was just scowling, that they had heard all my best talking points and they were getting madder and madder and redder and redder. And I could tell I wasn't reaching them. And when I had kind of exhausted my efforts to try and convince everyone in the room and finally having to address that person at the back, I realized that, they don't like downtown. They don't like taxes. They don't like me. I would close with this. I would say, well, all I can tell you is we're creating a city where your kid and your grandkid are going to choose to live. Well, they hated that argument because they knew it was true. If you lived in Oklahoma City in the 1980s, you saw a generation of young people leave. And today they're in Atlanta and Dallas and Brookline. They're all over the place. Basically, people my age. My high school classmates are not in Oklahoma City. And that was not their design. It was just we didn't have jobs that measured up to any significant educational attainment. And so there's this overwhelming consensus that today in Oklahoma City, the young people that grow up there are very likely to want to stay. And we have in-migration now from the Dallas metro and from California. And if you study demographic and shifts in population, you understand that Oklahoma was losing people to those 2 areas for decades. And now it has shifted around. And it's all because we have placed a higher value, or we have really been less value conscious and placed a higher value on design and try to create higher standards for ourselves. I'm not as good as Jeff is at promoting my books, but I did write a book, The Next American City.
It's a
And
great
what I
book.
talk about in that book is that Oklahoma City had become a city of low standards. We did everything as cheaply as possible. And as a result, corporate America wanted nothing to do with us by 1990. They were going to other places to invest their money. And what we decided to do, step by step, there wasn't any one day where we decided to do this, but step by step, we saw the value of higher design and an attention to detail and doing things not at the base level, but going above and beyond and creating a memorable city where people might want to live. And that has paid exponentially for us.
Mary, you'll be pleased to hear I was in Wichita. We're doing a downtown plan for Wichita.
Fantastic.
And what we heard was we're losing our kids to Oklahoma City.
Yeah.
All right. I'm afraid we are really just about out of time. I want to ask a super quick last question, which is just to say, here we are at Georgia Tech, a top research university full of students who have to do research papers of some kind. I'd like each of you identify what is a research question you would love the next generation to pursue.
I'll go first because I think you're looking at my image. Most of the research, and I think you could see from my talk, most of the research that I can use has to do with before and after longitudinal studies of places where streets are changed. So crashes beforehand, injuries beforehand, business beforehand, and then of course everything after. That is super useful to us. One thing that I'm very interested in, because the data is limited, are the before and after injury stories regarding the one-way to two-way reversions. We have one or two studies, but not enough. And then I think similar research could be very helpful when it comes to property values and street trees. Some studies have been done, but I would love to see more information, more work done on how street trees actually accrue income back to the city that benefits the city for planting them.
I would like to see more modeling around the autonomous vehicle. I think it has the potential, if done right, to have a profound effect on the cities of the future. And I'd love to see more work about how we can embrace that technology and prepare for it the best we can. I think the cities that do that are going to benefit.
Fantastic. And with that, that really is all the time we have. Thank you, Mick, Jeff, and JT, and all of our attendees. You've been listening to episode 48 of Redesigning Cities, the Speedwell Foundation Talks at Georgia Tech. A video and podcast of this event will be posted to the Redesigning Cities website after Halloween.